Is into detail on how I set up a carb cycle and how you could start a carb cycle on your own. Carb cycling is a very difficult process to figure out. It's not the easiest way to diet, so a little disclaimer before we get started. If you aren't the kind of person that can be really strict and follow a program, carb cycling is not going to be for you. If you're the kind of person who wants to see great results in a short period of time and long-term benefits, carb cycling is the right way to go. So you first have to understand that this is not going to be easy, it's going to be challenging, and you have to be very strict and regimented with your program. In the last video, I already explained how carb cycling kind of works, the science behind it. Now today what we're going to do is go into an actual carb cycle. So let's start. I know a lot of people have a lot of different variations of carb cycles, and I'm going to tell you why most of those are wrong. I'm going to tell you the right way. I believe in a 4-day rotation, and I'm going to explain to you why. So, after about 3 days of no carbs, your body is already in a ketosis state to where your body is burning excess stored body fat for energy. That is exactly where we want to go to be able to get you lean. But what we want to avoid, past the glycogen storage and now into the muscle to where you're starting to lose muscle density. So I believe that a 4-day rotation is a perfect amount of time. 3 days low to moderate carbs, with every 4th day keeping a high carb day to keep that metabolism healthy and burning at a high rate. So what that means is a basic carb cycle for a guy would start at a 100 grams on day 1, 200 grams on day 2 and 3, and 400 grams on day 4. That is a basic intro carb cycle. A lot of people, they get that when they first start with me and they say, oh well, a lot of people have the same carb cycle. Yes, you do. That is because I'm starting you with a baseline to see how your body responds, to see where your metabolism is at, and then we adjust from there, either up or down. Most of the times we're always adjusting up. Unlike any other diet, when you do any kind of keto diet or intermittent fasted kind of diet, when you follow those programs, they're all restricted caloric diets, which means as you're restricting your calories, your body's demand for calories lowers along with the lowering amount of calories. So your body learns how to function on those lower level of calories. And the end result of that is slowing your metabolic rate and slowing your resting metabolic rate. So we want to avoid that. Carb cycling is an infinite process. It's never ending, which means that we could do a carb cycle for the rest of your life and continuously making progress every day, every week, every month, every year. So this is why this program is amazing for the long-term health benefits and to be an amazing competitor in the long run. So let's go into that. We have a 100 gram carb day on day 1, 200 grams of carbs on day 2 and 3, and day 4 we're going to do a higher carb day of 400 grams. Now let's get into the other side of the carb cycle. This is the part that a lot of people make a big mistake on. They do what they call a refeed day, which they're doing high calorie foods and high carbohydrates at the same time. This is what we want to avoid because of the fat content. So fat content is a huge portion to making the carb cycle work effectively. So let's talk about fats. On a carb cycle, we make sure we consume the largest amount of fats on the low carb day to make sure that our body doesn't go too far into a deficit of calories. The body is using those fats as an energy source so that we don't dip too far down into our muscle reserves. So what it would look like is this. On day 1, we have 100 grams of carbs, and on average, we're going to do about 50 to 75 grams of fat, depending on the person's metabolism on day 1. As we taper the carbs up, as they increase, the fat is going to decrease. So on a moderate day, like 200 grams, we would lower those fats, say, down to about 25 grams. Now that is because we're increasing the calories from carbohydrates, so we're going to cut the calories from the fat intake. Then we get a high carb day, like a 400 gram day. That day, this is the most important part to my program, guys, and this is where a lot of people do it wrong. On a high carb day on my program is 0 fat, or as little as possible. You can avoid some trace fats in the food, but we do no extra additional fats. Now people in the past, they all do these high carb days with donuts and everything else. That is not effective, and I'm going to tell you why. On a high carb day, your body is so insulin sensitive that we want all those carbs to do what they're supposed to do. Those carbs are supposed to rebuild muscle glycogen, repair and rebuild, and boost that metabolism. Fats will take priority over digestion. So what that does, if we do high fats on a high carb day, we're slowing the body's ability to synthesize all those carbohydrates and convert to muscle glycogen. We don't want to slow that process. So what we're going to do is eliminate the fats so that the carbs can do what they're supposed to do, so they can break down quickly and the body can absorb them and use them properly and use them quickly. So that is a really key component to a carb cycle, is making sure there's no fats on that high carb day. So no more refeed days, high carb days. Now along with that comes the cardio portion of a carb cycle. This is another key component to a carb cycle. What we do is quite opposite of what I see a lot of other people doing. This is the way I do a carb cycle. On your lowest carb day is going to be your higher fat day, but it's going to be the most amount of cardio you're going to do. So low carbs, high cardio. I see a lot of people trying to structure their programs to where they do the most amount of exercise on their high carb day. That is a mistake. We're going to do the most amount of volume on the low carb day. So let's say your day one is 100 grams of carbs now, and you have 50 grams of fat. We're going to do an hour or 45 minutes to an hour of cardio on that low day. And that's going to be challenging. You don't have a lot of reserved energy, so it's going to be difficult. That day is hard. We're going to do an hour of cardio, 60 minutes. What that's going to do is deplete the body of glycogen. On day two, we're going to up your carbs now to 200 grams. That day, we're going to cut your cardio down to 30 minutes. We're going to do the same thing on day three. 200 grams, 25 grams of fat, 30 minutes of cardio. Now, here's the real key. High carb day. This is the most important, guys, because all 3 days leading up before this is all leading to making sure that this day is the most effective. So on your high carb day, we are going to do 0 fats. We're going to do 0 cardio, right? Now people ask me, why 0? Because we don't want to burn those carbohydrates off. We've been burning them for the last 3 days, putting our body in a deficient state. We want to now allow those carbs that we ate to go ahead and rebuild and replace all that muscle glycogen, and heal and restore and rebuild new muscle cells. So why would we do cardio on that day? All we're going to be doing is burning off the calories that we're trying to store and use to replenish and rebuild all those muscle cells. So on that high carb day, 0 fat, 0 cardio. That is really, really important to making sure you do a carb cycle properly. For a female, it would be the same basic premise. The same 4-day rotation. We just go lower numbers just due to the fact that women have a little less muscle density and they don't require as many calories. So we would just structure it and taper it down. So for example, maybe for a female, on a low carb day it would be 25 grams versus a male at 100. On a medium day, they would be, let's say, 75 grams. And then a high day would be 150 to 200 grams. The same thing, we'd scale down those fats a little bit. So let's say on day one, on a 25 gram day, they would be at 50 grams of fat. On day two, we'd scale it down to 25 grams of fat. On day four, same thing for women, 0 fats on that high carb day. This is really, really, really crucial to making sure this carb cycle works properly. Now let's go into how you can mess it up. You can mess it up very easily. If you ruin one day of that cycle, none of it works. You can't make up a lost day. So if you say, oh man, I did great on day one, but I cheated on day two. Well, day 3 and day 4 are irrelevant now. They're not going to work. So this is why I tell you guys, when you do a carb cycle, if you're going to do it, you have to be perfect. Otherwise, you could get fat very fast. So this process could either make you leaner and more muscular, or you can increase your body fat if you cheat and you don't do it right, which I see happen very, very often. Now, the other part that goes to the carb cycle, which is everybody understands about bodybuilding, is one of the most basic components to bodybuilding, is your protein intake. So the best way to start a carb cycle and know your protein intake, usually for females, I do about 1 gram per pound of body weight, or per pound of desired body weight. So let's say you're wanting to be 150 pounds on stage or 125 pounds on stage. Well, I would eat 1 gram, 1 nutritional gram of protein equal to 1 pound body weight. So if you weigh 125 pounds, we're going to eat 125 grams of protein. For a male, I like to do about 1.5 grams, right? So average male is usually somewhere between 250 to 300 grams of protein consumed a day. That doesn't change on a carb cycle. Protein stays consistent. Now that being said, where your protein comes from could definitely be different. Remember, there's a large amount of trace elements and trace fats in the foods that you're consuming. So if we're doing a 0 fats on a high carb day, pay attention to the protein sources that you're using. Red meat's probably not going to be the best option. Beef is not going to be a great option because the content of fat is a little higher. So you want to look for those leaner proteins to use when you're on a high carbohydrate day. This is the details, this is the secrets of Team Zero Gravity. Now here's the real key though, guys. In order to know how or when to adjust the carb cycle, takes a professional and takes a trained eye. I have 25 years of experience of knowing how to look at somebody's body and know when they're ready to adjust. But here's a little tip. Here's a little example of how you can know when it's time for you to adjust your carb cycle. The goal with carb cycling is to stimulate the body's metabolism to burn at a higher rate, which means when we're doing this on a 400 gram carb day, probably for the first 1 or 2 rotations, right? For the first 8 days to 12 days of following this, your body weight will increase after high carbohydrate day. So let's use, for example, let's say you're 200 pounds and the day before your high carb day you weigh 200. Most of the time when you first start a carb cycle, you're going to eat your high gram of 400 grams. You're going to wake up the next day and you're going to be 202, 203 pounds. Then you're going to say, wow, but I'm trying to lose. This is why the carb cycling is not a quick process, it's the long run. So for the first couple of rotations, you're definitely going to wake up and you're going to be a little bit heavier. If that's the case, don't be afraid, don't slow down. Keep that 400 gram day, because probably by the 3rd or 4th time you do that rotation, you're going to get on the scale, you're going to wake up and say, oh man, I lost 1 or 2 pounds. This is exactly what we're looking for. It's because we're training the body's demand for calories to increase. So when that happens, we know it's time to go ahead and increase those calories. We don't adjust the lower and moderate days, we start increasing the high day. So let's say you're at 100, 200, 200, 400, and now you're losing weight, you're waking up lighter the day after your high day than you were the day before. Now, we know we need to increase. So let's increase those carbs now to 500 grams. And you're going to gain a little bit of weight for the first couple of rotations, now at 500. But there's going to be a day you wake up and you're going to be lighter. And then we increase to 600 and 700 and 800, which is why I said this process is infinite. There is no end to this. You can consistently make progress as far as increasing muscle density, lowering body fat, stabilizing your hormones, and just living a healthier and a better looking life.